In a climate-controlled basement beneath the British Museum, in a storage annex outside Philadelphia, in the vaults of the Yale Peabody Museum, and in the back rooms of Istanbul's archaeology museums, there are more than 500,000 clay tablets sitting in the dark. Most of them have never been photographed. Most of them have never been read. Some have sat untouched since the day they were excavated more than a century ago, wrapped in newspaper from the 1920s, boxed and shelved and quietly forgotten. That number is the real starting point of this story, because it explains why, when a headline appears online claiming that an artificial intelligence just translated a Sumerian tablet and uncovered some shocking secret about human origins, so many people believe it instantly. The mystery is real. The backlog is real. The silence coming from that warehouse of unread clay is real. What is not real in almost every case is the headline itself. It helps, before going further, to remember how difficult it was for humans to read this material in the first place, long before any machine got involved. Cuneiform was not always mysterious. It was once simply how business got done across an enormous stretch of the ancient world, from southern Iraq to Iran to Turkey, for roughly 3,000 years. Then sometime after the last cuneiform tablet was pressed, somewhere around the 1st century of the Common Era, the knowledge of how to read it vanished almost completely, and it stayed vanished for close to 2,000 years. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries brought back drawings of these strange wedge-shaped inscriptions carved into ruined palace walls in Persia. And for generations, nobody could say with any confidence whether they were writing at all or simply decoration. That inscription, written in 3 different cuneiform scripts describing the same royal proclamation, became the closest thing the ancient Near East has to a Rosetta Stone. And Rawlinson's painstaking copying and comparison work, alongside contributions from other scholars working the same problem independently, eventually cracked Old Persian cuneiform, which in turn opened the door to Akkadian, and later, and with considerably more difficulty, Sumerian, a language unrelated to any other language known to survive today. It took another generation of scholars after that, simply to establish that Sumerian was a distinct language at all, separate from Akkadian, because early decipherers kept assuming every cuneiform text they encountered must be a dialect of something already familiar. Different channels, different narrators, almost identical titles. AI just translated ancient Sumerian tablets. Scientists used Grok to decode a lost civilization. Terrifying knowledge about human origins revealed. The claims escalate from video to video, each one promising a bigger secret than the last, and almost none of them cite an actual research paper, an actual museum, or an actual named scholar. Ask where the tablet is housed, and the trail goes cold. It happens anytime real ancient history collides with unfamiliar technology, because the combination is genuinely irresistible. A dead language, a machine that seems to think, a secret too big for textbooks. It sounds like the plot of a film, and that is exactly the problem, because the actual story, the one happening quietly in university labs right now, is stranger and more human than the fake one, and it deserves to be told properly. To understand why an AI cannot simply push a button and translate a Sumerian tablet the way a phone app translates a road sign in Tokyo, you have to understand what cuneiform actually is. It is not an alphabet. It is not even really a single language. The same wedge-shaped cluster might mean one thing on a tablet from Uruk around 3200 BCE and something entirely different on a tablet from Nineveh 2,000 years later. Clay tablets crack, crumble, and get reused. Scribes abbreviated. Regional dialects drifted. This is why the field of Assyriology exists at all, and why it remains one of the smallest, most specialized branches of the humanities anywhere in the world. A graduate student entering this field typically spends years learning Sumerian grammar, then Akkadian grammar, then the paleography of how individual signs changed shape across centuries and dialects before they are trusted to transliterate a single unpublished tablet with any confidence. It could not read the clay tablets themselves. It could not look at a photograph of cuneiform wedges and understand them. What it could do was take text that a human expert had already converted from cuneiform signs into a standardized transliteration, and then generate a rough English rendering of that transliteration, similar in spirit to an early version of a translation app. Guthers described the goal plainly in interviews at the time, saying the aim was to remove some of the language barrier for people who wanted access to what was behind the cuneiform without needing to become fluent Akkadian readers themselves. It was published as open research. It did not claim to have decoded any lost secret. It offered instead a tool that could help human scholars move faster through a backlog too large for a shrinking number of them to handle alone. 5 years later, a different but related project pushed the technology a step closer to the clay itself. In 2285, researchers at Cornell University, led by computer science professor Hadar Averbach-Elor, working with colleagues at Tel Aviv University, published a system they called ProtoSnap. Its target was not translation, but recognition, the far more fundamental problem of teaching a machine to actually identify individual cuneiform signs from photographs and drawings of tablets. including damaged, worn, or unusually shaped characters that had defeated earlier automated attempts. Cuneiform is brutally difficult for computer vision because the same sign can look meaningfully different depending on the era it was carved, the region it came from, and the particular scribe's hand, and a system trained only on clean modern reproductions tends to fail badly the moment it meets a genuinely ancient, chipped, and irregular tablet. Averbach Elor explained the core difficulty in terms any of the field's specialists would recognize instantly, describing the huge variability in character forms across the ancient world as one of the central obstacles the team had to design around. ProtoSnap addressed this by training the system to recognize the underlying structure of a sign, its strokes and proportions, rather than memorizing one rigid template, and by using that structural understanding to generalize toward characters it had never seen cleanly before. The result was a meaningful improvement in raw sign recognition, a step that sits well upstream of anything resembling a finished translation, but a genuinely useful one, because before a tablet can be translated, it first has to be reliably read at the level of individual marks, and that step alone has occupied serious researchers for years. To understand why that step matters so much, imagine trying to teach a computer to read handwriting where the alphabet itself changed shape gradually over 3,000 years, where regional scribal schools developed their own local variations, and where the only surviving copies were pressed into soft clay that then cracked, chipped, and eroded over millennia underground. A sign that looks like a tidy cluster of wedges in a modern printed sign list might appear on an actual excavated tablet as a smudged, partially broken impression, missing a third of its strokes, sitting next to a crack running straight through the clay. Human experts learn to make confident judgment calls about signs like that only after years of exposure to thousands of real, imperfect tablets, building an intuition that is very hard to write down as a simple rule. ProtoSnap's contribution was to give a machine learning system something closer to that same structural intuition, training it on the underlying geometry of how wedges are built and arranged rather than on rigid, idealized templates, so that it could make reasonable guesses about damaged or unusual signs, instead of simply failing whenever a tablet did not look exactly like its training examples. That is a narrow, technical, unglamorous kind of progress, the sort of result that gets reported in a computer vision conference paper rather than a viral headline, and it is also exactly the sort of incremental improvement that the field actually needs, because it directly attacks the bottleneck standing between the 500,000 tablet backlog and anyone's ability to read it. Alongside these efforts, other groups have been building the unglamorous infrastructure that any of this depends on. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, a long-running collaborative project based primarily out of institutions, including the University of California, Los Angeles, has spent more than 2 decades methodically photographing, cataloging, and digitizing cuneiform tablets from museum collections around the world, creating an open database that researchers everywhere can search and reference. More recent projects have built machine-readable datasets specifically for training and testing new AI models, including large collections of Sumerian and Akkadian transliterations paired with images drawn directly from tablets already cataloged through projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. This is the unglamorous truth about how the field actually improves. It is not a single dramatic breakthrough moment where an algorithm suddenly understands a dead language the way a person does. It is thousands of hours of digitization, careful benchmark building, incremental gains in sign recognition, and modest, honestly reported improvements in machine-assisted transliteration, each one published, peer-reviewed, and built directly on the last. None of it involves a general-purpose chatbot, casually revealing a secret about the origins of human races. That framing does not describe how any of these systems work, and more importantly, it does not describe how any real historian, linguist, or geneticist studies human origins at all. It is worth pausing here on that specific claim, because it is the most dangerous part of the viral pattern, and the reason a request built around it deserves to be handled carefully rather than simply repeated. The idea that ancient texts might reveal some hidden truth about separate human races, distinct in origin, treated as fundamentally different categories of people, is not a neutral historical curiosity. It is one of the oldest and most thoroughly discredited claims in the history of pseudoscience, repeatedly recycled across the past 2 centuries by people looking to dress up racial hierarchy in the borrowed authority of archaeology, genetics, or ancient scripture. Actual human population genetics tells a very different and, frankly, more remarkable story than any of these viral videos ever do. Modern humans share the overwhelming majority of their genetic variation in common, with only a small fraction of that variation distributed along the geographic lines that people historically labeled as race, and those lines are gradients, not walls, shaped by migration and mixing that never stopped happening. Sumerian cuneiform tablets, meanwhile, say nothing at all about biological race in the modern sense. What they actually document is closer to the opposite kind of story. They record trade with neighboring peoples, treaties between cities, hymns to shared gods, workers of different origins laboring inside the same temple economies, and administrative lists that group people by occupation, by city, by household, never by anything resembling the racial categories that later centuries would invent and impose backward onto the ancient world. When a video claims a Sumerian tablet reveals a shocking truth about human races, it is not reporting a discovery. It is repackaging an old ideological claim in new technological clothing, and dressing it up with the borrowed credibility of both ancient Mesopotamia and artificial intelligence, two subjects that most viewers correctly assume they do not know enough about to fact-check on the spot. That gap between what people can verify and what they are willing to believe is really the engine driving this entire genre of video. Sumer sits at what is often called the beginning of recorded history, the first known cities, the first known writing, the first known law codes, and the first known epic literature, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem old enough that fragments of it were already being copied and recopied for well over 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible existed in anything like its current form. Because Sumer sits at that specific point of origin, at the literal beginning of the written record, it functions almost like a blank screen onto which modern anxieties and modern fascinations get projected. Ancient astronaut theorists point to Sumerian descriptions of gods descending from the heavens and claim evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, ignoring that descending, ascending, and dwelling among the stars are standard features of religious language across dozens of ancient cultures with no contact with each other at all. Fringe genetic theorists point to Sumerian creation myths describing humans being fashioned by gods from clay and divine blood, and claim evidence of ancient genetic engineering, ignoring that the actual function of that myth, within its own culture, was to explain why humans existed to serve the gods through agricultural and temple labor, a purely religious and economic explanation with nothing to do with biology as anyone today understands it. Real Assyriologists read these same texts every day, and what they actually find is a remarkably sophisticated Bronze Age civilization grappling with mortality, kingship, flood, famine, and the demands of an unforgiving landscape between two rivers, using myth, the way every ancient culture used myth, to make sense of an uncertain world. Take the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, easily the most famous piece of Sumerian and later Akkadian literature to survive. Strip away the viral packaging and what the poem actually is, in the plain reading that generations of trained translators have produced from the original tablets, is a story about a king who watches his closest friend die and cannot accept it, who travels to the edge of the known world searching for a way to escape death, and who ultimately fails and has to return home and find meaning in what he actually built, the walls of his city, rather than in the immortality he wanted. It contains a flood story, a version older than the biblical flood narrative by well over 1,000 years, which scholars have long understood as reflecting a shared regional memory of catastrophic Mesopotamian river flooding, refracted through religious storytelling, the same way flood myths appear independently in cultures on nearly every continent that has ever dealt with a major river or coastline. None of that requires ancient aliens or hidden genetic secrets to be remarkable. It is already one of the oldest surviving meditations on mortality that human beings have ever written down, and that fact alone should be enough to hold anyone's attention without a single fabricated claim attached to it. That story does not go as viral as a secret about hidden human races, but it happens to be true, and it happens to be far more interesting once you actually sit with it. So what is genuinely happening with artificial intelligence in ancient Mesopotamia right now, stripped of the viral packaging entirely? It is a quiet, difficult collaborative effort between computer scientists and Assyriologists to build tools that can help a shrinking population of human experts move faster through an enormous backlog of material, most of which has been sitting untouched in storage for a century or more. It is systems like Guthertz's early translation model, designed to take existing scholarly transliterations and produce a usable first draft in English, saving a specialist hours of manual work on straightforward administrative texts, while still requiring human review before anything is treated as reliable. It is systems like ProtoSnap, designed to solve the far more basic problem of recognizing individual signs from photographs of damaged, worn, or unusually formed tablets, a necessary early step long before any translation can happen at all. It is decades of patient digitization work through projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, quietly building the shared image and transliteration archives that any future AI system will need in order to be trained responsibly in the first place. None of these efforts have produced a single dramatic secret about human origins, because that was never the goal, and because that is simply not what this kind of research looks like when it is done honestly. What these efforts have produced instead is incremental, carefully measured progress on a genuinely hard technical problem, progress that could eventually help unlock a meaningful fraction of that 500,000 tablet backlog sitting in museum basements, tablets that likely do contain real discoveries, just not the kind that fit into a 2-minute hook. There is also a deeper irony sitting underneath all of this, one worth sitting with, before closing the loop on where this leaves us. The entire reason these viral videos work is that most viewers correctly sense that cuneiform is genuinely mysterious, genuinely understudied, and genuinely sitting on real unanswered questions. That instinct is not wrong. Those questions are not secret because someone is hiding the truth. They are unanswered because the discipline capable of answering them is small, underfunded, and running out of time faster than most people realize, as senior scholars retire without enough new specialists trained to replace them at the same pace. Tablets keep getting excavated and digitized. That is the actual urgent story hiding inside every one of these fake AI headlines, quietly buried under the noise. A genuine race against time, playing out in university departments most people have never heard of, between a shrinking body of irreplaceable human expertise and a growing mountain of ancient writing that risks staying silent not because of any conspiracy, but simply because there may not be enough time or enough trained people left to read it all. What artificial intelligence actually offers here, when it is used honestly, is not a shortcut around that human expertise. It is a way of extending it. A well-trained sign recognition system does not replace the scholar who has spent 30 years learning to read Akkadian legal formulas. It gives that scholar a faster first pass through a stack of tablets that would otherwise have taken years to even sort through, freeing their limited time for the genuinely hard interpretive work that still requires a trained human mind, judgment built from decades of context, and a willingness to say, I do not yet know when the evidence really is ambiguous. Once you actually look at it closely, it is a considerably bigger one, and unlike the version chasing views right now, it happens to be true. Somewhere in one of those storage rooms on a shelf that has not been opened since the excavation team packed it up generations ago, there is very likely a tablet holding something genuinely new, a forgotten contract, a private letter, a scrap of poetry nobody alive has read since the scribe who wrote it set down the stylus. It will not reveal a hidden race of ancient humans, and it will not need to, because the truth waiting inside that clay is already remarkable enough on its own terms. It is the record of people, ordinary people, doing what people have always done, building cities, raising families, burying their dead, and trying, one wedge-shaped mark at a time, to make sure something of their world outlasted them. The only real question left is whether we build the tools and train enough people fast enough to go and listen before that voice goes silent for good.